The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. Amen, amen, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or the smallest part of a letter will pass from the law, until all things have taken place. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys and teaches these commandments will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven." The Gospel of the Lord. I just want to point out a couple of things this morning. One, very simple, and then the other, a little more detailed. First of all, notice these famous words of Jesus: "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law, the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill." In mainstream Christianity, there has been a great allergy against the law amongst Christians. Many people tend to look at the Bible and split it into two parts: the Old Testament, which doesn't really apply to us anymore, and then the New Testament. Thank goodness we got rid of all that Old Testament stuff, right? Sometimes you'll hear people say things like, "Well, I'm more of a New Testament Catholic," We're reminded in this passage here, Jesus did not come to abolish the Old Testament. He came to fulfill it. And it's important for us to remember that when we think about those things. Now, I just want to point out something about the first reading today from this book of Deuteronomy. So as we know, Deuteronomy is Moses giving basically his last instructions, his last will and testament, his last sermon before he died and the people entered into the promised land. And at the beginning of this book of Deuteronomy, he's about to reiterate the commandments. And this is what he said about the commandments. He said, "Observe them carefully, for thus will you give evidence of your wisdom and intelligence to the nations. They will hear of all these statutes and say, 'This is a great nation, truly wise and intelligent. What great nation is there that has God so close to it as the Lord? What great nation has statutes and decrees that are as just as this whole law I'm setting before you today?'" Now, I was struck by this passage because, again, I think when we think about the Old Testament, and especially when we think about the laws, think about all those laws that the Jewish people of old had to obey, and all of the liturgical rubrics they had to follow. I think sometimes when we think about that, what would you say if you were an Israelite in those days receiving all those laws and commandments and rituals and instructions? At least me, I have a tendency to think that, man, that would seem kind of burdensome, right? It would seem kind of overwhelming. And yet, according to Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, what he says is that if the people obey all those laws and rules and commandments, it won't be something burdensome. Rather, it would be something that would set them apart, and other nations would be inspired by this people of Israel and want to join the people of Israel. I was thinking about that today. Do we not fall into that same trap so many times as Catholics? How many times do we find ourselves apologizing for the church or for her teachings or all of our different traditions? How many times do we find ourselves as Catholics saying, "Well, I'm Catholic, but," except for this or that? Or when we speak to people about the faith, again, we try to qualify so many things about the church. Instead of being so proud of the church, being proud of what we're a part of, talking about how beautiful and how great Catholicism is, how wonderful our faith is. The whole point of joining the church, the whole mission of the church, is to lift the world up. And Catholics in the world appear to be set apart from the world, calling the world up, the church's standards. Not the standards of normality and mediocrity, but the standards of radicality, the standards of radical holiness, radical courage, virtue, and love. This is the mindset we need to have when we think about the church. And I would suggest that in terms of evangelization, I think we need to have less apologizing, more pride, more passion in our church. Just one closing thought about this. One thing that has always stood out to me about this is Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II, as you know, he was the Pope from 1979 until 2005. And when he was a young priest, that was during the time where the church was undergoing so many different changes, right, with the Second Vatican Council and other things. And there was a great tendency in the church, rather than to set the church apart, but rather to make the church more worldly, right? And when Pope John Paul II was a young priest, this was very common. And one of the things I found striking in the biography of Pope John Paul II, written by George Weigel, is he interviewed many people who were ministered to by Pope John Paul II as young people. And those young people, again, like they saw in most of the church, they saw the church constantly making compromises with itself. And people who were in youth ministry, they were kind of dumbing down the faith, or they were trying to make the teachings less radical, less bold. And what these people who were ministered to by Pope John Paul II, what they tended to say was, we looked around at the church and the different priests and the different ministers, and so many people were trying to accommodate the church to our standards. But when we saw John Paul II, we wanted to be like him. We didn't want him to be more like us. We wanted to be like him. Isn't that the perfect image of what we should be portraying as the church? People don't want the church to be more worldly, but they need the church, people in the church, to inspire them to be more like them. Ave Regina Caelorum.